Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined by Robert Mogielnicki, the Senior Resident Scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. It is mid-March 2022. No better time, Robert, to have you at the table. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's just kick off with the headline that grabbed my attention early this week, which was a very public an announcement that Saudi Arabia were looking to invite the Chinese president to come to visit Saudi Arabia this spring, reported in the international press as if it was some kind of snub to Washington. Just the posture of the reporting alone indicates that somehow this relationship from the West to the Middle East is a little bit strained at the moment. It has been perhaps, and it creates an opportunity to elevate the Chinese Gulf relationship. How do you see that at the moment?
Well, it's difficult to disaggregate the what's actually going on from how it's then refracted into the media. I guess I take a little bit of a longer view on things, and even if we go back a couple of months, we saw a large delegation of Gulf officials going to China. I suspect that during that visit and well before it, there were discussions about officials moving in the other direction, Chinese officials, at the highest levels, also visiting the Gulf. So I'm not sure that this is was intended to be a direct snub to, Washington, for example, but certainly the timing makes it easy to portray it as such.
Well, in that it isn't. It doesn't stand alone as an independent outlier kind of moment when we've had recent reporting that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were not answering Biden's telephone call. That or by coincidence, or perhaps it's somewhat aligned with that, the UAE ambassador in Washington made a statement at the end of last week to try and it would appear to be accommodating to Biden's request for more oil. Oil prices fell $10 or $12 a barrel. So there seems to be a lot of context within which the frustrated relationship with Washington and the Gulf is at the same token being parallel with the China one. And it is not new, as you said. Is it getting worse, or is it just something that's sort of moving along without too much drop or increase?
Well, I would say the latter view, but with a caveat. I mean, there certainly are tensions between Gulf countries, in particular Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and and the Biden administration here in Washington. There's no doubt about that. And as we see geopolitical tensions, heightened across the globe, in particular in the aftermath of the invasion in Ukraine. We're seeing, even more of in some instances, desperate attempts by the administration to reach out to try to address a whole host of issues, at the forefront, definitely the energy crisis and the price of energy that is going to have major implications, on the political landscape here in the U.S. Now, with that being said, I still like to revert back to what I think is the most useful way to understand where Asian, great superpowers and major countries like China sit within the mix of partnerships, Gulf partnerships. And I think Gulf officials would say, look, we have a network of partners. Among them, we have our American partners, we have European partners, and we also have Asian partners. And China, of course, is a very important
But before we go too down that rabbit hole, and ultimately
Sure.
we have many partners, but we have only one bodyguard, and I think that's something that does sort of loom large on everybody's consideration, and I'm trying to just understand whether this bodyguard is currently dozing outside the door with his hat tilt over his eyes, having a snooze, or not, because I think the perception seems, and it's not just a Biden thing, right? Trump was in office when the biggest event of security violation happened in recent years, i.e. the destruction of Abqaiq, generally perceived to be by the Iranians or allied forces to the Iranians, although nobody ever, I think, it was proven to be guilty or claimed responsibility. But nonetheless, a very significant moment, 5 million barrels of Saudi production knocked out. Trump didn't do really anything about it. Biden hasn't really responded to pricks here and there by the Houthi missiles. Is that all adding up to something? Is there a message in that? Is Washington saying, listen, you better go and find new partners? Is there any messaging in that? How should that be interpreted?
Well, the short answer is I'm not quite sure what the Biden administration, their message is in that, beyond the fact that they hope that the regional partners will take a little bit more initiative to resolve some of the regional issues. They don't want to be bogged down in intractable issues that they don't see a very clear and immediate way out of. That seems to be obvious to me. But the bigger question is, how are our Gulf partners interpreting that lack of support, as you said? I mean, we don't have to look very far back to remember the missile and drone attacks in the Abu Dhabi international airport, and the Emiratis perceived that in the aftermath of those attacks, it took a long time, from their view, to make for the U.S. to make a real show of force. I think U.S. officials feel a little bit differently about that. But the question is, I guess, be that as it may, do we see the Chinese then coming in to offer to fill the vacuum, so to speak, to play the role of a security partner? Something that a lot of analysts seem to jump the gun and say, oh, yes, well, this has created a vacuum and the Chinese are going to fill it, and this has created an opportunity for the Chinese. I like to say, or I like to ask, where is the evidence of this? I mean, there's very little evidence that the Chinese are doing this. I mean, yes, we see some examples of, commercial joint ventures to build drones with the Chinese. Okay, is that at all on the level of rising to the historical significance of a security partner like the U.S.? Absolutely not. The other bigger question is, does the Chinese government in particular view the Middle East and the security situation in the Middle East as a top priority for China? And I think that is, a really good question worth asking. And I would probably say no. I mean, it certainly is an important part of the world for the Chinese. We may talk a little bit later about,
well, I would suggest perhaps they don't have to answer that question right now, because your tax dollars, I don't know if you're a tax-paying American person, but nonetheless, yes. So your tax dollars are paying for the security of Chinese energy, and I'm sure they are very grateful to you for delivering that to them every day. How sustainable is that narrative? I mean, in this equation that we're talking about, the US and the West, and I think this is why this moment is a little bit seminal from my sense of perspective, that with the war in Ukraine, it's kind of putting a with us or against us scenario narrative back on the table, very infamously, I think, said by Donald Rumsfeld or Bush at some point in the modern era. But nonetheless, the idea that this is one of those moments, and it doesn't feel like the Middle East is it's at least at the minimum maintaining a middle neutral posture. And I'm wondering, is this a moment where having an agnostic posture towards the West will be accepted, or is that a risky calculation?
Well, of course, we're living in a world where we have major catastrophe in Europe. The invasion of Europe, I think, caught a lot of people by surprise, the speed at which it happened. And it is very quickly as this war goes on, forcing people to take a side, forcing governments to take a side, and operating in that neutral ground is increasingly difficult. And I suspect it will continue to be so. But maybe if I back up just a little bit, yes, this is a seminal moment. This is, I think in many ways, this period that we're living in may be an inflection point for a recalibration, a reconfiguration of diplomatic relations across the board in many respects. But if we go back to the fundamentals of America's, footprint and presence in the Middle East, yes, we do see examples of recalibration. We do see examples of reconfiguration, but that presence is not disappearing. I mean, the security presence as well. It may be changing, it may be evolving, and that's certainly going to happen from administration to administration. But we can also still point to many examples where America's presence has been established, it's firmly supplanted in the region, and it is still there at the moment. Now, if we look on the other side of the equation with China's presence, we see examples of quasi-mediation where the Chinese say, let's talk. We want to help solve this problem, but there's absolutely no commitments there. And there's, a lot of plausible deniability if talks don't work out.
I mean, at the end of the day, we sort of mentioned earlier that the security framework that the West and America in particular provides to this region is the Chinese there's nothing to indicate remotely that they're willing, or even as we said, they don't need to do it now because the Americans are doing it. But ultimately their position is, we've got the Belt Road Initiative. We're spending billions and hundreds of billions of dollars building a commercial corridor of connectivity to you, which is our security, i.e. everybody's an economic winner, so everybody's safe and stable. Right up to the Port Gwadar in Pakistan. I can barely see it from my window. The idea is that a narrative that's got credible legs to it.
Well, there are some economic rewards to be reaped by partnering with the Chinese under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. But at the same time, the Belt and Road Initiative is a big boon for partners in the immediate neighborhood of China. Then, the ultimate destination of the Belt and Road seeks to arrive in Europe and also in African markets. So on the way, of course, you pass by the Middle East and in some senses by the Gulf. But by and large, if we look at the overland corridors and the maritime corridors of the Belt and Road Initiative, they largely go over and around the Gulf. The Suez Canal is really important, as you mentioned. We see Pakistan, the Pakistan economic corridor being very important. And then the Gulf is trying to figure out Gulf countries are trying to figure out how they can be important nodes connecting these major markets in Asia to Africa and Europe. That's not always so easily done. I think some countries have done a better job. The United Arab Emirates has done a good job positioning themselves as a transshipment hub. Oman is trying to do it with the port in Duqm. They didn't see the Chinese investments materialize at all along the magnitude that the Chinese promised. And quite honestly, Saudi officials will also say in closed door discussions that the Belt and Road Initiative is a mirage here in Saudi Arabia. I mean, this really hasn't materialized in a way that we're happy with. So I think there is
yet they've just signed. I mean, the Chinese have just signed or some form of MOU. I don't know if it's anchored in the ground yet, of substantial nature, but nonetheless, they're deeply getting into bed with the Iranians. With a sort of grand bargain over 25 years worth, I can't remember the number, was it 40 billion or some huge number of dollars? Ultimately, it seems the Chinese have the ability and the opportunity to be deeply connected with both Tehran, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and everybody. Maybe they are the better person to be the overarching lord of the region because they seem to have a pass by everybody.
Well, yeah, the agreement that you're talking about, the 25-year strategic agreement, has been a bit of, there's been a great deal of controversy surrounding this. mainly in the sense that it seems to be very hyped up and it's unclear. Some of the early reporting throughout these figures was actually the first figure was $400 billion over this 25 years of investments. And a lot of people came out and said, absolutely no way that's going to happen. That figure is astronomical. That being said, this is a long-term comprehensive agreement. It touches economic realms, security realms, and a whole host of other different points of collaboration. So yeah, it's significant. I guess if you take a longer look at the historical role of China in the broader Middle East, and specifically in the Gulf, on both sides of the Persian Gulf, you see China being,
or the Arabian Gulf for that.
So matter. The Arabian Gulf. So on the Arabian side and the Persian side, let's say.
Yes.
We see the Chinese being, extremely successful at surviving with their reputation intact. Often, playing two different partners off against each other, or having, maintaining really positive relations with the Iranians and GCC partners, for example. I mean, and this goes back decades. China maintained positive relations with both Iran and Iraq, selling weapons during the Iran-Iraq War. Maintained positive relations with Kuwait and Iraq, throughout that invasion and thereafter. So the Chinese have a history of being able to maneuver through very tricky, difficult diplomatic relations and come out on the other end essentially with their reputation intact. But I think there's a cost there at the end of the day, that the partners at the end of the day see this happening. China's partners in the region see how they are playing different, partners, not against each other, but essentially, maintaining positive relations, but not really going much further beyond that, not being the partner of choice, like the U.S. has been, and in some cases, like many European partners are when it comes to the economic trade and investment and economic partnerships. So
ultimately what they have, or what is in the core of that partnership, if you like, while, as we've talked about, the West and America in particular continues to provide that security umbrella for the region, China is their biggest customer. This is a commercial transactional relationship in which everything is bedded in that, in the way that the West, to a great extent, is no longer, or maybe they will become again, given what's happened out of Russia, as the Europe looks for new sources of energy. But ultimately, the Middle East, or the Gulf, is sending most of its energy by a vast majority to Asia, and the biggest customer in Asia is China. Mm-hmm. Is that the pillar? Can that be the only pillar in which this house is built?
Well, it's certainly a foundational one. The Chinese wrote a Arab policy paper, which kind of gave an idea about how they view their engagement with the broader Arab world. And the Chinese government thinks about the GCC and Gulf countries as a somewhat stable sub-element of the broader Arab world and Middle East. And the pattern that they use for engagement, for economic engagement, is a 1 + 2 + 3 economic cooperation pattern. And the core that represents the one in that equation is energy cooperation. So they view that as the fundamental thrust of relations. And that is, as you said, borne out in just the trading figures. 2 has to do with trade and investment. And this is, moving beyond the energy realm, looking at other areas of trade and investment, investments in UAE free zones in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai, Duqm special economic zone, those, investments of that ilk. The third tier, which I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of, involves Chinese investments in high and new technologies. Everything from satellites to nuclear to renewables. And this is a new, a domain that I think, as we move from those traditionals, the energy and then the trade and investment, which, China's a huge trading partner. You can't ignore it. Also, the Gulf countries are not going to get much slack from traditional trade and investment cooperation with China. But as we move into that third tier, and certain forms of collaboration in these high new technologies really pick up speed, I think that is an area that is going to cause increasing consternation in Washington and also in a number of European capitals as well. So that is, in some senses, the trajectory of economic cooperation. But at this stage, we can still say that the foundation and the core of economic relations still does very much harken back to that energy, those energy partnerships.
In terms of these sort of big bargains that's going on, I mean, we have very significantly the Iranian nuclear talks, the JCPOA in Vienna. Of course, China and Washington and Moscow are parties to that agreement, but yet it seems to be that the US and to a certain extent Europe, who are the partners to that agreement as well, are the ones that the Gulf states seem to put the burden and the blame on for rapprochement with Iran, whereas China and Moscow don't seem to carry any of that burden, at the same time enjoy that dual relationship. What is China's interest in this Iran talks arriving at a successful outcome, or an outcome in which the JCPOA gets restarted, even though the Gulf states seem to be very uncertain about what that means for them?
Well, I think what we're going to see is China continuing to operate in a diplomatic sphere that is very comfortable doing so. And that is precisely sitting on the sidelines, saying we want to facilitate talks, we want to facilitate a solution, an agreement, doing so in a way that requires very little commitment on their end. And that's why exactly, and the Chinese have worked very hard to occupy that position, where no matter what way in which these negotiations ultimately end, I mean, if it ends with a deal or without a deal, the Chinese are going to have been working very hard to be able to sell their role as ultimately, a net positive and a success. So I think
it strikes me they have they have the most at stake here, because ultimately, as you said, the number one of the three numbers is energy. And if there's no nuclear talk solution and we have some level of rupture in the region because of the pursuit for nuclear weapons in Iran, yes, everybody's going to suffer, but ultimately the West doesn't depend so much on the energy from here. China is very dependent on the energy from here, and yet they don't seem to convey any great urgency, or at least express it extrovert wise that this is a problem that needs an immediate solution.
Well, yes, and that's part of the diplomatic strategy. I mean, conveying a sense of urgency would then require them, would may drag them into negotiations in a way that requires them to make certain commitments, to actually make them more involved in the outcome, rather than sitting on the outside and trying to position and hedge and say, okay, if the outcome goes this way, then this is how we're going to sell it, we're going to market it. If the outcome goes in the other direction, this is how we're going to deal with it. This is a typical strategy of diplomatic engagement by the Chinese. I like the term quasi-mediation. It's not real mediation. They aren't taking the lead in hosting these discussions.
Is it successful? Is it working for them? Are they likely to change it, or any reason why they would need to?
Well, so far, I believe it's been successful for them. I don't think there's any evidence that the Chinese need to, or there's a sense of, that they are compelled at the moment to play a greater role in as a security guarantor in the Middle East. At the moment, that need really is not there. There might come a time where that is the case. But quite honestly, right now, if you're sitting in Beijing, why would you feel that you need to make the commitment? It's just I don't think that need is extremely compelling at the moment. So
well, they don't have the capability, I suppose, to project that sort of distance in terms of Navy resources, and of course they're much more concerned about the South China Sea. Maybe we could just wrap up a little bit talking about the big year that it is in China, and does it have ramifications for the Gulf? One is clearly they're in some kind of economic slowdown, whether it's to what extent it's self-inflicted, to what extent they're, their 30-year juggernaut of building, as Sarah Palin once said, the bridge to nowhere. They have an army of bridges to nowhere. Ultimately, I'm just wondering, where do you see China in 2022? Sub 5% economic growth, which for them is a record low for the last 3 decades, and what the ramifications of that may be for the Gulf countries.
Well, you have a deceleration of growth in China, which is certainly going to, make people rethink about, the sustainability of this growth model. You have very serious concerns about a troubled real estate sector and a financial, a broader financial industry that's wrapped up in real estate, questionable and kind of shaky investments in real estate. All of this means that I think Chinese companies are looking at their own economy and saying, well, in some senses, we've saturated our markets. In other senses, we're dealing with crackdowns from the government telling us, how much we can, market our services or how we can market our services, and really impacting the bottom line of a lot of Chinese firms, specifically technology firms. And all of that leads me to believe that the external markets, places like in the Middle East, in the Gulf, in Asia, in other countries in Africa, and also in Europe, these are going to be very important markets for Chinese firms to increase revenue, as they try to shift their revenue bases more from domestic to international sources. And in that sense, we're going to see Chinese firms, trying, as they have been doing, quite honestly, for the last couple of years, to tap into some of the wealthier markets in places like the Middle East, in Europe, and also in Africa. And so we will see Gulf countries, the Saudi Arabias, United Arab Emirates, even Qatar, for example, being targeted by a number of prominent Chinese firms to help boost those overseas revenues.
I wonder if they're paying attention to the sanctions that Russia are currently under, and they themselves may be thinking that, we might have to make a choice here because of that internationalization of the Chinese economy. Inevitably, it can only be predominantly in the West. Russia wouldn't offer them much.
Yeah, well, of course, the Chinese are going to have to make the same calculation that many are making right now with respect to investments in Russia, whether those are existing investments or the prospect for future investments. That is certainly, there's always a risk involved there. There are risks in any investment, but as the last few weeks have demonstrated quite well, a very risky investment, very volatile. It's uncertain, what will happen in the future. So, all of this adds up to an equation where the Chinese have to, the Chinese government in Beijing has to think about what its position in the world will be going forward. And this is something that they are constantly doing, trying to strategize, trying to position themselves as a superpower. And to bring things back to this, to potential visits to the Gulf, where we started our conversation, the Chinese have been pushing for several months now, back, starting in 2020 and throughout 2021, when everyone was focused on the coronavirus, to say, hey, our Gulf partners, we have a strategic relationship with you, in some senses, comprehensive strategic partnerships. You say that we're important to you. We want you to make more of a show of it. And they have been hammering that message home with official letters, I'm sure in unofficial conversations with diplomats. And, this ultimately came to a head and culminated with this quasi-coordinated GCC and foreign minister delegation that went out earlier this year to China. And I suspect that visit will be reciprocated with a number of high-profile visits as well to the region. Would
that be a sort of a posture boosting opportunity for President Xi as he looks to extend into a third term, unprecedented in Chinese history since Mao, which he's hoping to do at the end of this year, that kind of red carpet show in the Gulf?
This will involve a lot of posturing. And they will, they'll be successful.
Will there be one of those Trumpian orbs where where they all gather and put
I'm not sure if he'd want to walk in those exact footsteps, but there will be a lot of posturing. And then at the same time, when you speak with Gulf officials, they say, yes, I mean, we this is an important partnership for us. We had to make a show of it. But if push comes to shove, we'll go with the Americans every time. I mean, this is always the kind of the conversation you hear. I still believe that despite all of this posturing and despite these discussions about Gulf allies abandoning America, snubbing America, that there is a period of tension. There are some issues to work out, but the fundamentals of the relationship are still strong. The
well,
US...
we did one of these interviews, Robert, recently with a senior official in India, and his words were about the Ukraine tragedy and everything was that they were very concerned that Europe and America, the West, if you like, we're going to get bogged down in a conflict in Europe, sort of mud wrestling with what he called a declining power of Russia, while the real opportunity in business to be done is in Asia and the rising China, and that's where all of the resources should be and all of the engagement. And perhaps the Gulf states would share some similar idea that the future is here, give us your time and attention, and the lack of it perhaps is causing people to be a little bit upset and a little bit nervous. But we have to leave it there. We could talk about these things all day, and I'm sure there'll be other opportunities to do so, because these things are not going away. If anything, your corridor of expertise, China to the Middle East, is only in some ways in its infancy. So you'll be well served to keep drilling in that space. So Robert, thank you so much for your time and being on Halftime Talk this week.
Yeah, thank you very much.